"What the hell was that?" I yelled. "Holy crap! What the hell just happened?" Remembering where I was and who I was with, I looked over at Terry. He was looking back at me with an equally surprised expression. "Tell me what you just felt," he asked quickly. The sensation was still fresh in my mind. "Man, that was creepy," I said. "It was like, I don't know, a bunch of hands touching me." I shuddered at the memory. Terry looked at me in utter amazement. "This is most unusual, and I do not understand the meaning," he said. "This does not happen often, and I've never known it to happen to one of your kind." He shrugged his shoulders. "I mean no offense. I'm just very surprised and do not understand what this portends. I think maybe—" He trailed off as in deep thought. "Terry, what the hell is going on? Did something bad just happen?" Terry came back into focus and looked up at me. No, it is not a bad thing," he said. "It is actually a very good thing, a very rare and wonderful thing." He paused for a moment as if trying to find the correct words. "You have been shown favor. It is a great honor." I still had no idea of what he was talking about. "Honor? Shown favor? By who?" I asked, looking around. He just waved his hand. "You wouldn't understand, but I think it is a sign that I am close. We should fish now." I could clearly see that something had excited him, and seeing no point in trying to press him further, I jumped at the suggestion to fish. After what had just happened, I needed a dose of the really real world anyway. So I grabbed my rod and plug bag and followed him down to the water's edge. The quarter moon provided just enough light to see that the conditions were about as perfect as they could be. As we arrived at the water's edge, he turned toward me and handed me a plug. "Use this. It has worked well for me as of late." The plug was monstrous in size compared to the plugs we typically threw, and had two giant treble hooks hanging from it that looked like they were handmade from Siwash hooks. I was skeptical, to say the least, but the size of the deep crescent-shaped marks around the front hook convinced me to tie it on. Besides, I thought, it's been a weird night already, so why not? We made our way out to some near-shore rocks and started fishing. Terry was on a rock slightly west and a little further out than the one I was on. I started fan casting toward what I perceived to be a deep hole to the left and out from our rocks, and was surprised at how well the big plug he had given me casted. I'm sure he probably explained why while I was busy snoozing on my rock by the fire. It also seemed to dig really deep. We casted into seemingly lifeless water for a short while, and out of the corner of my eye it seemed to me that Terry wasn't really intent on his fishing. He appeared to be very focused on what I was doing, watching me, as if expecting something to happen. It was actually a bit unnerving. Then again, the whole night had been just that so far. With the phenomenal fishing we had been having of late, I found the current lack of activity strange. Pulling fish on either tide can make you spoiled in a hurry, and as I stood upon my rock, my short attention span started kicking in. With the fish-catching prospects looking dim, I began thinking about my exit strategy. It had been a long and interesting night thus far, but all things must come to an end. So I called it my last cast and started cranking a little faster, just to hasten that end. I took the plug off of a submerged rock just as I figured out what I would say to Terry in parting. 3 cranks of the handle later, I got slammed. In spite of my lack of attention, I instinctively set back hard. How often this happens, I laughed to myself. Just when you're ready to move or leave, you get whacked. I leaned hard on the fish, determined to get it in quickly, release it, and make my exit, but the fish had other ideas. Despite the considerable pressure I was applying, it almost seemed as if the fish didn't even realize anything was wrong yet. For the first handful of seconds, it just kind of moved off in an easterly direction, slow and deliberate. Then all hell broke loose. The fish headed straight up and broke the surface about 30 yards out, thrashing its head back and forth, trying to free itself of the plug now firmly attached to its maw. With the amount of water being thrown and the noise it was making, I knew that this was a big fish, a really big fish, and my legs started shaking from the infusion of adrenaline that was hitting my blood. Failing to free itself of the plug, the big fish hit the afterburners and headed east. My drag screamed as line flew off my spool at an alarming rate. Being a veteran of several 40s and 150, I had never encountered anything like this, and my mental comparisons quickly revealed that I was in uncharted waters. This fish moved with a power and purpose I never thought imaginable, veering, diving, changing direction, all the while running me dangerously close to being spooled. As the initial run progressed, I did something I never do and palmed the spool a bit to try and slow her down some. The bucking of my rod showed that it had little or no effect. I increased the pressure even more when it became evident that I was down to the last 30 or 40 yards of line. I sensed a slight slowing of her forward progress, and in a last-ditch state of panic at being spooled, I clamped my hand over the spool, leaned back, and held my breath. The parabolic bend of my rod matched the shape of the bright crescent moon overhead as her forward progress finally came to a halt. Now it was her turn to panic, and in the far distance I heard her once again surface, shaking her head furiously in a futile attempt to throw the plug. With a returning sense of hope that I might actually land this fish, I leaned even harder, keeping the line tight and removing any chance of her shaking the plug free. Having failed to free herself of the plug, she sounded, sulking in the deep while she considered her next move. It didn't take her long. She broke directly towards shore as my worst fears were realized. Being over 100 yards downwind, she would have her pick of rocks to wrap me on when she reached the inside bowl of the cove. My only hope was to get her turned toward me and keep her headed in that direction, getting her as close as possible before she rested enough for a second run. I leaned with all my might to pull her off her course, and thankfully her tired muscles betrayed her. As she turned in my direction, I furiously pumped and cranked back down, in rapid succession, regaining precious line while giving her little opportunity to make a move. But as she came toward me, her resting muscles began to shake off the effects of her initial run, and as she drew closer, I could feel her renewed energy gathering itself. Without warning, she broke for shore. I leaned as hard as I dared, and while I was able to move her toward me some, I knew it wouldn't be enough. She was close, but close only counts in horseshoes and landmines, so when she became parallel to shore, I waited for what I knew would come. The ping on my line told me that she had just managed to pass over the top of a rock. Moments later, I felt that grating resistance that said you are getting wrapped and the end is near. I hung on for a few more precious moments. In a move divided equally between desperation and defeat, I opened my bail, dropped my rod tip into the water, and screamed at the night sky in disgust. Having completely forgotten where I was, I looked over to the rock that Terry was on. He stood there, rod at his side and facing in my direction, evidence that he had been watching the whole event unfold. I looked back down at my reel and in the moonlight saw that no line was moving off the spool. In utter dejection, I figured she had spit the bit, so I flipped the bail and started cranking in the line. As my line came tight with a sense of life, my heart leaped out of my chest. Inexplicably, she had turned and headed back out into open water, and she had not shaken the plug. She had me beat dead bang, but didn't have the patience to stay in the rocks. Smiling at my ridiculous good fortune, I leaned back into battle, and she responded in kind. Her second run was determined, but lacked the power and strength of her first foray. It also put her further into open water. Sauce for the goose, I thought, for if I played it right, I might now have a chance at actually putting a gaff in her. I no longer tried to move her and let the rod and drag do the work. I didn't want to spook her, just let her wear herself out as she was still a little too green to be horsed into the shallows. Her circular runs exposed her desire for gaining deeper water, but were her ultimate undoing, for it left her few options other than to pull herself into exhaustion. Before long, the lactic acid did its thing, and she began to feel more like dead weight than the knockdown, drag-out fighter she had been minutes before. I stepped down from my rock and began to move her toward me. Lean, reel down, lean, reel down. She was near now. In the moonlight, I could see the wake her back was making as she waddled back and forth, and I mentally crossed my fingers that she wouldn't start rolling or thrashing when I got her in tight. My whole body was shaking from nerves and exertion, and I became aware that I was talking aloud, sort of a play-by-play of the in-game. As she came almost within reach, I waited for the last-ditch battle, hoping that my line wouldn't catch on a rock edge in part. But the battle never came. She was shot and offered only token resistance as she rolled over on her side within a rod's length of where I stood. I was stunned by the size of her, clearly a 60, maybe more, bigger than any fish ever seen around these parts. As I reached for my gaff to deliver the final coup de grace, I was startled to see Terry standing right next to me. In that soft, even voice of his, he said, "You must not do this." With all the adrenaline in my blood and a huge bass at my feet, I had trouble understanding what he was talking about. "Do what? What are you talking about?" I asked. "You must not do this," he repeated softly as he looked down at the gaff in my hand. The realization of what he was asking hit me with the impact of a gunshot. "Oh, no, 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 what? You want me to release her? What are you, nuts?" I yelled. "Look at her, Terry. That's the fish of a lifetime. You want me to let her go?" Terry held up his hand to silence my protests as my prize washed into my legs, nearly knocking me over. "You must let her go," he said. "This is important. It is a test." "A test?" I asked. "A test of what?" "A test to see if you are worthy," he said as he lowered his hand. "Worthy? Worthy of what? What are you talking about?" Terry took a deep breath, and I could see that he was growing impatient. "Worthy of favor. You have been shown favor. It is a gift, a very rare gift that must be repaid to show that you are worthy." Despite my desire to seal the deal, his sincerity stayed my hand from putting the gaff in her chin. "Please," he pleaded. "We do not have much time. I will explain later, but we must act now before it's too late. You must trust me on this." I stood there for several seconds, torn between two opposing actions, before the sincerity of his plea finally won out. I dropped my shoulders and looked down at the massive fish gone belly up at my feet. "I can't believe I'm actually going to do this," was all I could say. With no apparent recourse, I set about the task of reviving the huge fish. The plug came out easy enough, but she was pretty well spent. Under Terry's watchful eye, I held her upright and moved her gently back and forth in the wash, coaxing as much water across her gills as I could. For several minutes I thought that I was on a fool's errand, as she did not seem to be responding at all. But right about the time I started entertaining the thought that I might yet get to keep her, I began sensing tension in her body, as well as her mouth clamping down on my thumb. A short time later her tail began to curl, her fins came up, and the pressure on my thumb began to get uncomfortable. With a quick shake of her head, she freed herself from my grasp, swam off slowly into the dark water, and was gone. I stood there staring out over the ocean in the direction she had just departed, trying in vain to understand what I had just done. I felt a sudden wave of exhaustion roll through my entire body, and now wanted nothing more than to go home and go to bed. Without saying a word, I grabbed my rod off the rock, turned, and started walking toward shore. Terry walked beside me, respecting my silence, until we reached the shore and had walked a short distance up the beach. He put his hand on my shoulder, halting my progress and forcing me to face him. I turned and stared down into the sand at my feet. His voice sounded pained. "Ray, I know this was a very difficult thing for you to do," he said. "That is the nature of these things. They are never easy, but you did well. You did the right thing." I looked up at him. "Yeah, well, maybe I did the right thing, but nobody is ever going to believe me now. It'll just be another fish story without the proof." The bitter tone in my voice surprised me, and I think it caught Terry a little off guard also, so I added quickly, "Sorry, Don't mean to take it out on you. I'm just... As my thoughts deserted me, I stared back down at the sand. I understand your anger, he replied, and then paused for a moment. But you should know that you can never tell anybody about what has happened here tonight. Ever. This is very important. My head snapped back up. What do you mean I can't tell anybody? I demanded. Why not? Because you will have wasted what you did here tonight, he said. You will lose the favor you have been shown and be deemed unworthy of the great honor bestowed upon you. I just shook my head. You keep saying this stuff. What favor? What honor? Who's testing me and why? I don't understand any of this. I threw my hands up in the air in disgust. All I know is I just let the fish of a lifetime go, and I have no idea why. Terry held out his hand to silence my tirade, and then took a deep breath, as if to indicate that he had no idea where to begin, so I figured I would save him the trouble. Yeah, I know I wouldn't understand, right? I said sarcastically. He just looked at me, seemingly sad at his inability to ease the pain of my decision. Look, Terry, I gotta go, I said, waving my hands. I'm so shot that I can't even think straight anymore. All of this Indian stuff has left me with a spinning head, a nasty case of bass rash, and a story I can never tell. Great. Just great. I turned and began the long trek back up the beach to my truck.